Hey guys, tonight we are going to gently turn the dark and forgotten pages of history to learn about one of England's least mentioned queens, Catherine Parr. She is famously remembered in history by the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. She was in fact the final survivor among the 6 wives of King Henry VIII, a monarch infamous for his bloody marriages. But Catherine's story is not simply one of luck. This is the tale of an intelligent woman, a pioneering author, who faced the death penalty from her own husband, a fate carefully averted only through a skillful theological debate. We will explore her turbulent life before she wore the crown, the passionate love she was forced to give up, and the personal tragedy following the king's death, including the destiny of her sole daughter and the heartbreaking truth about her forgotten grave. Don't think that the survivor is the winner. Sometimes, survival is just the beginning of another tragedy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. To help us fully relax together, please let me know where you are watching from and what your local time is right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Catherine Parr was born in the late summer of 1512, quietly arriving into a family of modest nobility in the softly rolling hills of northern England. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, was a gentleman of the county, respected, though not richly titled, while her mother, Maud Green, served as a gentlewoman in waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. From the moment she drew her first breath, Catherine carried a name steeped in royal favour, for it was the Queen herself who stood as Catherine's godmother, a connection that would linger like a gentle echo throughout her life. She was the eldest of 3 children, her younger brother William and sister Anne following her into the spacious nursery at Parr House. When Catherine was about 5 years old, tragedy arrived upon swift, deadly wings. The sweating sickness swept through England, sparing few. Sir Thomas Parr succumbed to that cruel epidemic, leaving Maud to raise her 3 young children alone. Yet, rather than despair, Maud Green saw opportunity. She believed that a woman's worth need not be defined solely by marriage or motherhood, but could bloom through the power of learning. In an age when most gentlewomen spent their days mastering needle and thread, Catherine's mother arranged for tutors to teach her daughter Latin grammar, the intricacies of French conversation, and the elegant cadences of Italian speech. Philosophy and theology were laid before her like rare delicacies, and she devoured each text with insatiable curiosity. By the age of 12, she could discuss Augustine's writings and recite passages from Cicero, while other girls whispered that embroidery was the proper pastime of a lady. Some say Catherine declared, "My hands are ordained to touch the crown and the sceptre, not spindle or needle." Whether legend or truth, the tale spread through noble circles, marking her as singular from her peers. Her household at Parr House was a modest one, yet within its walls Catherine found the freedom to question and to ponder. She listened to Maud's stories of court-life tales, of royal banquets, of queens and their rivalries, and learned to read the currents of politics as surely as one might read a stream. William and Anne, younger siblings though they were, often halted their play to witness Catherine's earnest debates with tutors, or to hear her practice reciting psalms in Latin. In turn, she protected them tenderly, guiding their lessons with a gentle hand when mother was occupied with managing the household or later, with attending Queen Catherine at court. As Catherine blossomed into her teenage years, the network of her mother's friendship with Queen Catherine of Aragon opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. She was invited to spend hours in the palace libraries, poring over manuscripts saved from the monasteries dissolved under Henry VIII's will. There, among dust-laden tomes and flickering candlelight, she built a foundation of learning that would sustain her through the dangers to come. Yet, despite her intellectual gifts, Catherine's path to royal marriage was not straightforward. She was 20 years old when her first husband, Edward Parr, was chosen for her, a match made less for love than for consolidating modest estates. Though he proved kind, his health was frail, and Catherine cared for him with the same dutiful compassion she later showed ailing monarchs. Their union remained childless and brief, for Edward passed away when Catherine was but 22, leaving her a young widow with neither heir nor inheritance, save a small pension. This early loss might have dashed a lesser spirit, but Catherine's education and character propelled her forward. She returned to her mother's home, not as a defeated woman, but as a scholar and survivor, her mind sharper and her will more resolute. It was in this state of renewed independence that she would first cross paths with Henry VIII, though not as his queen, but as a courtly lady whose reputation for learning and grace captured his attention. The very qualities that made her a remarkable scholar, her fluency in languages, her understanding of scripture, her poise before noble audiences, also made her a suitable companion to a king who prized both intellect and charm. When Henry's gaze finally fell upon her, it was not merely her beauty that captivated him, but the calm strength shining in her eyes, the gift of discourse she offered, and the gentle authority with which she carried herself. In that meeting, the foundation laid by Maud Green's unwavering belief in the power of a woman's education bore fruit. Catherine Parr would become the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, not merely as a survivor of his infamous matrimonial history, but as a learned and thoughtful queen in her own right. And so, in the hush of a northern summer where she first opened her eyes, Catherine Parr began a journey from noble daughter to royal consort armed with learning, fortified by loss, and guided by a mother's wise conviction that knowledge might be a gentle woman's truest crown. Catherine Parr's journey from a young widow of modest means to a woman of influence began, perhaps surprisingly, at the age of 17. Her mother, Maud Green, acutely aware of the family's limited financial resources and the social standing of the daughter of a knight without title, sought a match that would elevate Catherine's position. Through careful negotiation, she arranged her daughter's first marriage to Sir Edward Burgh, a gentleman of lower nobility who styled himself Baron Burgh, yet held only a small estate at his family seat in Leicestershire. The ceremony, conducted in the autumn of 1529, brought Catherine into a household where she quickly discovered the burdens of adult life. Sir Edward, though courteous and well-meaning, suffered from a chronic illness that confined him often to his chamber. For 4 years, 4 gentle, worry-laden years, Catherine devoted herself entirely to his care. She learned the art of nursing with patient hands, changing linens and poultices by candlelight, reading to him from devotional texts in Latin and French to soothe his fevered mind, and praying beside his bedside as the seasons passed outside their modest windows. Though they longed for children, none came. Yet Catherine never faltered in her kindness, seeing in her husband's frailty a call to compassion rather than despair. When spring arrived in 1533, and Edward's illness claimed him still in his early 20s, Catherine found herself a widow at 22, draped in mourning and holding a small widow's pension barely sufficient to maintain a modest household. Rather than retreat from the world, she returned to her mother's care in northern England, her heart heavy, yet her spirit unbroken. Here, within the familiar walls of Parr House, she contemplated the next chapter, one that her mother hoped would secure both safety and status. By the following year, in early 1534, Catherine accepted a proposal from John Neville, Baron Latimer, a man twice her age who had already lost 2 wives and had 2 children of his own, young John and his sister Margaret. For Catherine, this was a transformation from the quiet widow in Leicestershire to the Lady of Snape Castle in North Yorkshire, an imposing fortress of stone battlements and winding corridors. The marriage was, in part, strategic, a union that promised Catherine the protection and resources denied to her as a lone gentlewoman. Yet, amid the cold walls and draughty halls, a genuine affection blossomed between Catherine and Lord Latimer. She attended diligently to his estates, overseeing tenantry and steward alike, while also nurturing his children as though they were her own. Margaret, in particular, clung to Catherine with tender gratitude. In years to come, she would speak of her stepmother's kindness as the beacon that guided her through many hardships. Evening suppers by the fire grew warm with shared stories. Catherine read to the children in French and Italian, and on quiet nights she sang hymns learned in her youth, her clear voice echoing through the great hall. But the tranquillity of Snape Castle was soon disturbed by the tremors rocking England. In 1533, Henry VIII finalised his divorce from Catherine of Aragon in order to wed Anne Boleyn, a move that sent shockwaves through Christendom and led directly to the creation of the Church of England. 6 months later, in October of 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in the north, a popular uprising of Catholic loyalists objecting to the suppression of monasteries and the sweeping religious reforms. Recognising Lord Latimer's steadfast Catholic convictions, Rebel bands turned their eyes to Snape Castle, believing that he would champion their cause. One crisp, overcast morning, Catherine and her stepchildren watched in mounting dread as a cluster of rebels, numbering perhaps 10,000 souls, approached the castle gates. They demanded that Lord Latimer declare for their cause. Under duress, he acquiesced, forced to don the banner of rebellion around his arm while Catherine remained composed, gathering the children within the inner keep to shield them from the violence threatening outside. For days she negotiated quietly with the steward and the local magistrates, ensuring that Margaret and young John were never harmed, even as rumours swirled of worse fates elsewhere. Eventually, royal forces under the Duke of Norfolk advanced, quelling the uprising with martial law. Lord Latimer was briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London on suspicion of treason, but was released when Catherine's uncle and younger brother, both William Parr, used their influence at court to restore his honour. In the wake of this harrowing ordeal, the family departed Snape Castle for the relative safety of London. Once in the capital, Lord Latimer took his seat in Parliament, and Catherine, with her polished education and graceful demeanour, quickly adapted to court society. She attended masques and banquets, conversed fluently in Latin and French with ambassadors, and fostered friendships with influential ladies of the court. Her reputation as a learned and serene gentlewoman spread among the nobility, laying the groundwork for her next, most extraordinary role, that of wife to the formidable Henry VIII. Late in the autumn of 1536, a chill wind swept down from the Pennines into the broad expanse of Lincolnshire fields, carrying with it the rumble of discontent that would become known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. This was no mere skirmish of disgruntled peasants, but a widespread uprising born of anger over King Henry's seizure of church lands, the dissolution of monasteries, and the displacement of clergy who had served their communities for generations. When the rebellion coalesced, some 22,000 men, farmers, craftsmen, and displaced monks marched under simple banners, determined to restore their ancient faith and the authority of Rome over the newly formed Church of England. Among the strongholds targeted by the rebels was Snape Castle in North Yorkshire, home to John Neville, Baron Latimer, and his stepdaughter, Catherine Parr. Though Catherine herself was scarcely 24 years old, she had already weathered 2 marriages and learned the art of steady composure under pressure. On that grey October morning of 1536, she and her young stepchildren watched from the battlements as the rebel host, armed with pikes and scythes, advanced upon their walls. Initially, Lord Latimer stood resolute, refusing to yield to the swarm gathered below. Yet the rebels, many of whom were armed with the conviction of religious fervour, threatened violence against his family if he did not submit. In that moment of peril, Catherine's education and innate calm coalesced into action. She moved quietly among the castle's defenders, offering reassurance to frightened servants and comforting the children. Drawing upon her fluency in both Latin phrases of peace and the gentle cadences of English prayer, she spoke with the rebel emissaries, urging them to spare the innocent. Historians note that her appeals, more persuasive than any sword's edge, bought Lord Latimer time to consider a more diplomatic path. Under mounting pressure, Latimer reluctantly declared for the rebel cause, assuming the role of what the insurgents called Captain Latimer. Yet this political pivot isolated him from both sides. The king's commissioners viewed him as traitorous, while the rebels, suspicious of his change of heart under duress, felt betrayed by his earlier resistance. In the weeks that followed, Latimer journeyed to London to plead his case to King Henry's council. There, supported by testimony from Catherine's uncle and brother, both named William Parr, he convinced the council that his compliance had been coerced. They restored his honours and released him from any formal charge of treason. Emboldened by Latimer's apparent betrayal, the rebels returned to Snape Castle in greater numbers, intent on destruction. They ransacked the Great Hall, overturned the steward's accounts, and threatened to burn the castle gates unless their demands for religious restoration were met. As stones flew and pitch torches flickered, Catherine remained a steadfast presence. She organised a small contingent of guards, ensuring the safety of her stepchildren by stationing them in the inner keep. By candlelight, she counselled Lord Latimer on the perils of further resistance, while outside, she negotiated once more with rebel leaders, reminding them that the Lord's work must not be stained by the blood of innocents. Meanwhile, the royal army under the Duke of Norfolk began its march north. Martial law followed close behind. Hundreds of rebel leaders were hanged, drawn, and quartered as an example to others, while commoners faced summary justice. Against this backdrop of violence, Catherine's composure did not waver. She tended the wounded, fed the hungry, and wrote letters of appeal to both sides, invoking in the softest of Latin prayers the mercy of God upon all who would listen. When order was finally restored, Snape Castle stood battered but unbroken. Lord Latimer, his honour restored by royal decree, returned to his parliamentary duties in London. Catherine, who had stood firm throughout the siege, accompanied him to the capital, her reputation quietly soaring among courtiers. At Westminster, she moved effortlessly through grand halls and private chambers, her manner as genteel as ever, yet underpinned by the steely resolve that had saved her family. In the days and months that followed, Catherine's education proved invaluable. She engaged learned debates in Latin with foreign ambassadors, advised on matters of estate management in French, and even assisted Lord Latimer in drafting petitions regarding the welfare of displaced monks. Her presence at court was not merely ornamental. It signalled the advent of a new kind of noblewoman, one whose learning and poise could steer the currents of power as surely as any knight's lance. Thus, from the crucible of pilgrimage of grace, Catherine Parr emerged not as a mere bystander, but as a woman tested by fire, her mettle proven in the face of mortal threat. When she later encountered King Henry VIII himself, it was this blend of calm authority and learned grace that drew his attention. In the heart of political upheaval, Catherine Parr had cultivated not just survival, but the quiet confidence that would in time win her the greatest and most perilous honour of all, the role of Queen of England. After her departure from Snape Castle, in the spring of 1537, Catherine Parr found herself drawn more deeply into the glittering world of London's courtly society. Within weeks of taking residence in the capital, she received invitations to an array of high-profile ceremonies. She was present at the baptism of young Prince Edward on the 15th day of October, 1537, held in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. Thereafter, she attended the funeral cortege of Queen Jane Seymour in late October 1537, her dark gown and measured steps reflecting both genuine grief and an acute sense of propriety. When Henry VIII next took a bride, Anne of Cleves Catherine sat among the select few at the sumptuous nuptials on the 6th day of January 1540, where she observed the king's quick disillusionment and the ensuing political manoeuvres. Even as Catherine moved from one event to the next, her reputation for learned conversation and quiet dignity grew. Nobles and diplomats alike noted her command of Latin, French, and Italian. Her commentary on theological texts was admired, not dismissed as mere clerical pedantry. Yet beneath the veil of courtly elegance, Catherine's mind churned with questions that the old masses and ritualistic rites could no longer satisfy. It was during these years that she encountered the writings of Martin Luther and his followers. The first seed of Protestant thought was planted by the horror she still carried from the Pilgrimage of Grace, the Great Northern Rebellion of October 1536, when some 22,000 souls rose in defence of the old church and nearly engulfed her family's home. The violence and desperation she witnessed there stirred in her a yearning for spiritual renewal. Then, too, her older sister Anne Parr, who had served as a maid of honour to Queen Anne Boleyn, had adopted the new faith after 1535, bringing home clandestine pamphlets and sharing clandestine lessons in the doctrines of sola scriptura and justification by faith alone. These twin influences the memory of bloodshed in the north, and Anne's gentle mentorship drew Catherine toward the evangelical circle gathering around Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, and other reformers. She invited learned preachers to Snape before its fall, then, in London, met with them privately in the royal apartments, sketching out her own convictions on grace, repentance, and the authority of Scripture over tradition. Concurrently, Catherine's acquaintance with Sir Thomas Seymour deepened. Seymour, a younger brother of the late Queen Jane and uncle to Prince Edward, had been recalled to court early in 1537. He found in Catherine a rare blend of erudition and warmth. Though Lord Latimer still lived, Seymour frequently joined Catherine at princely entertainments and private dinners. His admiration was no mere courtly flattery. He praised her tender care of Lord Latimer during the Pilgrimage of Grace, and sought her counsel on naval affairs. He later became Lord Admiral, while she, in turn, appreciated his vivacious intellect and daring spirit. For several years their friendship was tempered by propriety and mutual respect. Catherine remained Lady Latimer, and Seymour, though attentive, respected the boundaries of marriage. Yet court gossip whispered of the king's eye, turned toward Catherine, and of Seymour's growing fondness. Each stolen glance, each discreet whisper in the rose garden, carried the weight of unspoken longing attention. Catherine felt keenly but did not rush to resolve. Then came the spring of 1543, when John Neville, Lord Latimer, succumbed to illness on the 25th day of March. His death at Snape Castle left Catherine once again a widow, this time at the age of 31, and with a reputation polished by experience. The passing of Lord Latimer did more than free her from marital obligation. It signalled to every observer that Catherine Parr was now unbound by the legal and social chains that had governed her first two marriages. The court took notice at once. Here was a woman of royal favour, tested by rebellion and bereavement, whose learning could rival that of any man in King Henry's council. And though Catherine harboured secret hopes of a future with Thomas Seymour, she understood with a sinking heart the peril of refusing Henry's own suit. To spurn the king, especially a king so accustomed to having his will obeyed without question, would imperil not only her newfound autonomy, but the safety of her entire family. Thus, as Catherine Parr closed the chapter on her marriage to Lord Latimer, she stood at the brink of her most consequential decision. Would she follow the gentle pull of her affection for Seymour, or would she yield to the larger currents of power by accepting the king's proposal? In that moment of transition from widow to possible queen, Catherine's life hung in precarious balance, guided by the quiet lessons learned in her childhood home and in the hallowed halls of London's court alike. In the 7th month of 1543, King Henry VIII, now a man nearing his 55th year, his once powerful frame diminished by the pains of a jousting wound, made his intentions known to Catherine Parr. The court murmured that his waist had grown to fit a garment of more than 52 inches, and that his great ulcer oozed constantly, masked by incense and burning herbs. Yet in his mind burned the singular desire for companionship and, more urgently, an heir, a Duke of York, to secure the Tudor succession. When Henry requested Catherine's hand, she felt the weight of history settle upon her shoulders. Though her heart longed for Thomas Seymour, she dared ask for time to consider. The king, accustomed to obedience, indulged this request, for he understood that refusal would imperil not only Catherine, but every member of her family. Thus, on the 12th day of July, 1543, in the intimate confines of the Queen's closet at Hampton Court Palace, Catherine and Henry were wed in secret. Present were only her sister, Anne Parr, the princesses Mary and Elizabeth, and a handful of trusted ladies and gentlemen. No trumpets sounded, no crowds pressed to gaze upon their monarchs, only hushed whispers in the vaulted chamber, as Catherine exchanged vows with a king whose past 5 wives had met tragic ends. From the very first dawn after her coronation, Catherine's gentle ministrations shaped her role as queen. Each morning she attended the king's bedside, lifting his blood-stained bandages and applying fresh cloths to his leg, wound an injury that had festered since his accident at Greenwich 3 years prior. She soothed his pains with herbal compresses and consulted the royal physician's ministrations, offering words of comfort when the ulcer's stench overwhelmed the court. In quieter moments, she read to him from scripture in Latin and French, her clear voice a balm to his troubled mind. Yet Catherine's talents extended beyond the chamber. When Henry departed in June of 1544 for his final campaign in France, the last great hurrah of his reign, he named her regent. It was the first time in English history that a queen had governed in the king's absence, and Catherine embraced the responsibility with uncharacteristic modesty. In her name, statutes were signed, proclamations issued, and the laws of the realm upheld. She convened councils, heard petitions from common folk and nobles alike, and ensured that the machinery of government continued without falter. Within the echoing halls of Westminster, her seal lay beside the king's own, a testament to her authority. Among her proudest achievements was the reconciliation of her stepdaughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Both had been declared illegitimate, Mary in 1533 and Elizabeth in 1535 after Henry's divorces from their mothers. Yet Catherine, with gentle resolve, urged the king to restore their birthrights. In the summer of 1544, Henry reversed his earlier decrees, welcoming his daughters back into the line of succession. The court rejoiced, and the royal family, long divided, found a measure of peace at last. It was a domestic triumph, unmatched by any martial victory, and it warmed the heart of a king who, long ago, had lost his mother and his sense of family unity. Amid these duties, Catherine Parr broke new ground in English letters. In March of 1544, she published Prayers or Meditations, the first devotional work in England, authored by a queen under her own name. The book, printed in London by the Royal Press, contained sermons, hymns, and reflections on the scriptures, encouraging laypeople, especially women, to read the Bible in English and deepen their personal faith. The tone was humble, yet firm. She wrote of the necessity of God's grace, urging Henry to complete the reforms begun at his coronation. Her foray into print drew fierce rebuke from the conservative Catholic faction at court. Rumours swirled that an arrest warrant for heresy lay ready at Windsor, that her household books, smuggled from the continent, would be seized, and that she might suffer Queen Anne's fate on the scaffold. Yet when royal agents arrived at Chelsea Manor to execute the warrant, they found Catherine seated at her desk, pen in hand. Before they could advance, Henry, having received word, issued a royal command. The warrant was to be destroyed, and no harm was to come to his queen. Thus, Catherine's life was spared by the very man she had urged to embrace reform, underscoring not only his affection for her, but his trust in her judgment. In the span of just 1 year as queen, from secret nuptials on the 12th of July, 1543, through wartime regency in the summer of 1544, to her landmark publication in the spring of 1544, Catherine Parr had excelled in 3 distinct roles. She was the devoted companion who tended to the king's suffering, the adroit regent who ruled wisely in his absence, and the courageous author who championed religious reform. No queen in the history of Tudor England had ever wielded such influence, nor left so indelible a mark upon her age. And though the road ahead would bring further trials, in these early months Catherine Parr stood as a quiet force, a gentle hand on a weary throne, guiding the kingdom toward peace and posterity. After establishing herself not merely as a deferential spouse, but as a forceful advocate for England's spiritual renewal, Catherine Parr ventured even deeper into the currents of Protestant reform. In countless private councils and whispered conversations within the royal apartments, she urged King Henry to complete the work of the Reformation, extirpating every remnant of Roman ritual and clerical privilege. Her first devotional work, Prayers or Meditations, had appeared in March 1544. Now, 2 years later, she prepared a second text to fortify her stance. On the first day of March, 1546, Catherine published Lamentation of a Sinner, a volume of heartfelt reflections and scriptural expositions. Printed by the Royal Press at Westminster, it bore the elegant device of her crowned Parr arms and included passages drawn from St. Paul's letters, evoking themes of grace, contrition, and personal communion with God. This was a daring enterprise. It marked Catherine as only the second woman in England to print under her own name, and the first queen to contribute to the burgeoning corpus of English-language Protestant writings. She wrote of the boundless mercy bestowed upon the contrite heart, exhorting lay readers, especially women constrained by custom, to seek divine comfort directly within the pages of Scripture. Yet not all welcomed her zeal. Within weeks of the book's release, court whisperers, many noble counsellors still reeling from the pilgrimage of grace, fanned rumours that the Queen was disseminating heretical tracts and undermining ancient worship. They cautioned the king that the same zeal which had driven his nobles to arms in 1536 now fueled Catherine's pen. Reports circulated that a secret warrant had been drawn up in the summer of 1546 for her arrest, mirroring the swift downfall of Queen Catherine Howard in 1539, whose downfall followed charges of adultery. King Henry, ever prone to sudden mood, found himself at once fascinated by Catherine's piety and alarmed by her audacity. One afternoon in July 1546, as a pale sun filtered through the mullioned windows of Chelsea Manor, royal guards assembled outside the gates under sealed orders. They bore the glittering badge of the king's warrant, prepared to lead Catherine away to face charges of heresy. But Catherine, by then attuned to the subtleties of court intrigue, moved swiftly to meet the crisis. She summoned her ladies and attendants, directing them to conceal every copy of her text that might confirm the whispers, hushing printing bills and burning any marginal notes. Then, without hesitation, she proceeded alone to the king's chamber in Hampton Court. Her entrance startled the guards in the narrow corridor. for they had believed her safely confined to Chelsea. Reaching the royal apartments, Catherine discovered Henry reclining upon his high-backed chair, his broad shoulders slumped and his swollen leg cushioned by pillows. Drawing near, she cast aside any pretense of regal formality, kneeling before him with humble grace. In measured tones, she spoke of her love for him and her sorrow that her writings had distressed his mind and courtiers. "My lord," she pleaded, "I meant only to distract thee from thy pain, that thy wounded spirit, like thy broken leg, might find some salve in the holy word. Never did I intend to challenge thy crown or sow discord." That moment, like a delicate turning of a tide, proved decisive. Henry's stern brow softened, and he recalled the countless nights Catherine had sat by his bedside, soothing his anguish with whispered prayers. As Catherine rose, the guards arrived poised to seize her. They halted abruptly at the threshold of the Queen's garden, where Henry stood leaning on his crutch. With a fierce sweep of his hand, he commanded, "Return to your posts!" His voice, though aged and sometimes faltering, carried the full weight of royal decree. The captains bowed low and dispersed the warrant, their armour clanking like fading echoes in the corridor. Thus, Catherine Parr's gentle diplomacy and fearless expression of conviction spared her from ruin. The episode underscored the power of quiet reason over drawn sword. By meeting danger with humility and clear intent, she disarmed the machinery of accusation. In the days that followed, she resumed her courtly duties, walking in the gallery, attending Mass in the chapel, and serving as gracious hostess to foreign envoys, while still urging moderate reform behind closed doors. Henry VIII's intervention in Catherine's favour did more than protect her life. It revealed the depth of his reliance on her counsel and companionship in his final years. Though the king's health would soon decline further, and though his successors would continue the tumult of English religion, Catherine's steadfast example charted a course for the future. Through her pen and her presence, she had opened a place for evangelical faith within the highest circles of power. And within the hush of Chelsea's garden, where guards had once prepared to bind her wrists, Catherine Parr walked unbound, her gentle courage echoing beyond the walls of court and into the unfolding story of Tudor England. In the first month of 1547, the great Tudor reign came to its inevitable close. On the 28th day of January, King Henry VIII, aged 55 and long burdened by the festering wounds of his jousting accident, and a body weighed down by obesity, breathed his last at Whitehall Palace. The chamber was hushed as physicians and courtiers stood witness to his passing. The bells of London tolled in sombre cadence, marking the end of an era defined by grandeur and tragedy. Within hours, the Strait Council assembled to carry out the late King's will and the provisions of the Regency Council. Under the terms set forth in Henry's final testament, Catherine Parr, recently widowed a third time, would relinquish her authority as regent. The guardianship of the young Edward, now King Edward VI, passed to his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who assumed the title of Lord Protector. Though Catherine had governed with measured wisdom during Henry's final French campaign, she recognized the necessity of yielding to legal decree. At 35 years old, she transitioned from Queen Consort to Dowager Queen, mindful that to contest the council's decision would risk not merely her position but her very life. In the days following the funeral rites, a modest ceremony at St. George's Chapel on the 6th of February, Catherine maintained a delicate balance of influence. She cultivated cordial relationships with the Protector and his advisors, attending privy councils as a guest rather than presiding. All the while, she watched over her stepdaughters, Mary, now 34, and Elizabeth, now 14, ensuring they remained present at court and respected in their new statuses. No longer officially regent, she nevertheless interceded on their behalf whenever disputes arose over precedence or appointments. In private moments, Mary and Elizabeth sought her guidance, finding in her a stabilizing presence amid the shifting tides of power. By mid-May 1547, Sir Thomas Seymour returned to London, bearing the title of Ambassador Extraordinary, dispatched from France to ratify alliances and secure Protestant support for the young king. His arrival at Catherine's residence at Chelsea Manor reunited two hearts long parted by duty. Within 4 months of Henry's death on the 9th day of July, 1547, the pair were married in a secret ceremony. Only the Dowager Queen's sister, Anne Parr, a handful of trusted attendants, and a discreet contingent of officers bore witness. The nuptials were intentionally cloaked in silence, for the Regency Council had made plain its disdain for the rapid remarriage of the Dowager Queen while Edward remained under their guardianship. Though the ceremony passed without immediate retribution, the clandestine nature of their union sowed seeds of discord. Princess Mary, who had once described Catherine as a comforting mother, now feared that her own rights would be imperiled by a new husband vying for influence. Elizabeth, equally close to Catherine, felt torn between affection for her loving queen and loyalty to her protector uncle Edward Seymour. The younger Seymour, brother Thomas, eagerly attended every state banquet and council meeting, his presence a silent rebuke to the formal restrictions placed on Catherine as a widowed queen. Court gossip swirled around the Seymour brothers, their rivalry intensifying into open hostility. Edward Seymour, protector of the realm, viewed Thomas's marriage to Catherine as a direct challenge to his authority. He feared that as Catherine's husband, Thomas would gain access to state papers and influence young Edward's education. Moreover, he resented the favour Catherine wielded with her stepchildren, particularly Elizabeth, whom Thomas treated with a familiarity that courtiers whispered was too intimate for a ruler's ward. Caught between personal devotion and political prudence, Catherine navigated these treacherous waters with characteristic grace. She introduced Thomas to young King Edward, arranging supervised afternoons at Sudeley Castle, where tutor and pupil might bond over lessons in arithmetic and classical history. She hosted private tea parties in the royal apartments for Princess Elizabeth, forging a plausible veneer of domestic calm. To Princess Mary, she penned letters, emphasizing her enduring loyalty, reminding her that no man, protector or king, could diminish the bond they shared. Yet beneath these conciliatory gestures, Catherine remained acutely aware of the council's watchful eyes. Edward Seymour convened frequent meetings at Somerset House, strategically positioning his brother's envoy Sir Thomas in the outer gallery, where he could overhear discussions but not partake. Catherine sensed that any misstep, any sign of favouritism, might provoke her former regent into extreme measures. Aware that Thomas Seymour harboured ambitions of his own, some courtiers alleged he aspired to the protectorate. Catherine tempered her public displays of affection, confining their more tender moments to the privacy of Chelsea Manor. Through it all, Catherine kept faith in the quiet power of maternal counsel. She discouraged Thomas from pressing his case too forcefully at council meetings, reminding him that Edward was still a boy of 12 and needed stability more than intrigue. To her stepson, she spoke in comforting tones of the Seymour brothers' shared devotion, hoping to prevent the seeds of suspicion from taking root in his young mind. And when Princess Elizabeth confided doubts about her stepmother's new marriage, Catherine listened without reproach, assuring her of her love and pledging to protect her place in the succession. Thus, in the year following Henry's death, Catherine's world was one of hidden ceremonies and whispered alliances. Though her heart soared in the secret joy of her union with Thomas Seymour, her mind remained vigilant against the undercurrents of jealousy and ambition that swirled within the Regency Council. For she had learned long ago that trust must be earned anew each day, especially in a court where bonds could shatter as easily as fine crystal. And in the hush of twilight at Chelsea Manor, Catherine Parr, Dowager Queen and Duchess by marriage, prayed that her choices would shield her family from the storms gathering once more on the horizon of Tudor England. At the age of 36, Catherine Parr experienced a miracle of late-age maternity. She became pregnant for the first time in her own life, despite having been widowed thrice. This event, so uncommon for a woman of her position and history, promised the fulfillment of her deepest longings, an heir to bind her to Thomas Seymour, and a final joy to crown her years of service. Yet, amid her swelling anticipation, Thomas Seymour's conduct began to cast a shadow over her hopes. In the spring of 1548, court observers noted Thomas's increasingly familiar manner towards Princess Elizabeth, then 14 years old. He was often seen slipping into her chambers at Greenwich or Chelsea Manor after dusk, dressed not in courtly attire but in the plain linen of nightwear. At first, Catherine dismissed the anecdotes as harmless pranks between a lively tutor and his ward. But when Seymour once reached forward, and gently parting the hem of the princess's gown before Catherine and several ladies in waiting, her heart constricted with alarm. She realized that what she had assumed to be youthful folly risked misinterpretation as impropriety. Throughout her pregnancy, Catherine devoted herself to safeguarding both her unborn child and her stepdaughter. She maintained strict observance of nutritious diets, roasted meats with softened herbs, fresh barley broths, and stewed pears while resting in well-ventilated chambers at Sudeley Castle. Each dawn she rose to offer prayers in her private oratory and to oversee the final revisions of her second devotional book, Lamentation of a Sinner, which she completed even as her form grew round with expectancy. Her steadfast composure and tireless work inspired loyalty among her ladies, and whispers of Seymour's behaviour gradually circled the corridors of the palace. On the 30th day of August in the year 1548, Catherine laboured in the great chamber of Sudeley Castle beneath a canopy of tapestry depicting the Annunciation. Attended by a cadre of women, Lady Jane Grey, her dear companion, among them Catherine bore a daughter, who drew her first breath at dawn's soft light. She named the child Mary Seymour, in loving tribute to her stepdaughter, Princess Mary, who had stood faithfully by Catherine's side through the years. The newborn's cry echoed through stone halls that had long known only solemn echoes, filling the castle with a fragile hope. But in the fragile hours that followed, tragedy struck. Catherine developed puerperal fever, known commonly as childbed fever, a ruthless infection born of unsanitary conditions and unchecked by the rudimentary medicine of the age. Within 4 days, her strength waned beneath the high fever and relentless chills. On the 5th day of September, 1548, Catherine Parr drew her last breath. She passed gently, her hand in Lady Jane Grey's, her face peaceful as though already dreaming beyond the confines of her earthly trial. The news of her death rippled through the court and across the realm. Bells tolled at Westminster Abbey, at Hampton Court, and at local parish churches, their mournful peals a lament for the Queen who had so steadfastly tended the kingdom's wounds. On the 15th of September, a simple yet solemn funeral was held in the chapel at Sudeley Castle, the first Protestant ceremony of its kind in England. The service was austere, prayers read in English, psalms sung without chant, and a modest procession of mourners clad in black. Among them were the young Princess Elizabeth, her eyes filled with tears, and Lady Jane Grey, who served as principal mourner, her veil damp with grief. Catherine's body was placed in a plain oak coffin, then carried to its final rest beneath the chapel floor. There were no grand monuments or ornate inscriptions, only the humble marker of a life devoted to faith, family, and reform. In the months that followed, her legacy resonated beyond her untimely passing. She remained the only queen to have published under her own name. Her 2 books, Prayers or Meditations and Lamentation of a Sinner, continuing to influence religious thought long after her death. Moreover, Catherine Parr had been the first English queen to hold regency powers, governing in Henry's absence and demonstrating that a woman's counsel could guide a nation. Her daring initiatives restoring the rights of Mary and Elizabeth, championing biblical literacy, and steering the Tudor court through its final, turbulent chapter imbued her memory with a clarity that outshone the sombre tales of the king's previous wives. Thus, though her body lay silent beneath the chapel stones, Catherine Parr's spirit endured. She had bridged the sacred and the sovereign, leaving behind a daughter destined for obscurity yet born of royal grace. And in the hush of Sudeley's fields, where the tapestry of her life had been woven, the gentle echo of her prayers lingered an enduring testament to a queen who embraced both crown and sceptre, and who, in the fullness of her trials, found a fleeting but cherished peace at last. After Catherine Parr's death on the 5th of September, 1548, Sir Thomas Seymour, now the wealthiest widower in England, revealed the full measure of his ambition. In the hush of Catherine's funeral week, he approached Princess Elizabeth, then aged 14, with words of affection and promises of marriage, his suit spoken so soon that court gossip had barely concluded its initial murmurings of Catherine's passing. Even more audacious was his plan to seize young King Edward VI for himself, believing that by controlling the boy king, he could supplant his brother Edward Seymour's authority as Lord Protector and become the kingdom's de facto ruler. Word of Seymour's conspiracies reached the Regency Council by early 1549. Alarmed by reports that he intended to carry the boy away under cover of night, the council moved swiftly. On the 14th day of January, 1549, Thomas Seymour was seized at his chambers in the Tower of London. He was tried for treason and, after a brief hearing, condemned. On the 10th of March, 1549, he was hanged on Tower Hill, his properties, including those bequeathed by Catherine Parr, confiscated by the Crown. The very wealth that once promised a gilded future with Catherine now vanished, leaving their daughter orphaned and without inheritance. Princess Mary Seymour, born on the 30th of August, 1548, found herself bereft of both father and mother before her first birthday. Within weeks of Seymour's execution, Mary passed from the care of the regency to the extended Parr family by law, yet none of her Parr relatives, burdened by their own debts and retirements, volunteered to assume guardianship. In a rare act of compassion, Catherine Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk and longtime friend of Catherine Parr, stepped forward. By April 1549, Mary Seymour resided at the Duchess's estate in Chelsea, watched over by a retinue of nurses and attendants whose stipends, though generous, strained even the Duchess's resources. Letters from Catherine Brandon to the Regency Council in the summer and autumn of 1549 beseeched them for financial support. She detailed the substantial costs of clothing, schooling, and lodging for the little princess, amounting to over £200 a year, a sum equivalent to the annual income of a minor barony. These appeals went largely unanswered, for the Protector's coffers were committed to the defence of Scotland and the upkeep of the young king's household. By December 1549, the Duchess's letters fell silent, and court records make no further mention of Mary Seymour's allowance. Scholars surmise that Mary's plight worsened in her final months. With no formal patronage and her nurse likely unpaid, the child's health may have declined rapidly in the harsh winter of 1550. Though precise records of her death are scant, it is generally accepted that Mary Seymour died sometime before her second birthday, perhaps in the spring of 1550, leaving behind no living issue and closing the brief chapter of Catherine Parr's direct bloodline. Meanwhile, Catherine's own mortal remains endured a posthumous persecution of their own. She had been interred at Sudeley Castle on the 15th of September, 1548, in a modest oak coffin beneath the chapel floor. The funeral had been the first Protestant rite for a queen in England, an austere ceremony in which English prayers replaced Latin liturgies. Thereafter her tomb rested undisturbed for nearly a century. During the English Civil War, which raged from 1642 to 1651, Sudeley Castle changed hands several times and suffered significant damage. In 1782, a local gentleman, intrigued by rumours of a buried queen, pried open the lead-lined coffin. To his astonishment, Catherine's body lay nearly intact, her linen shroud still binding her preserved form. But upon exposure to the open air, decomposition accelerated. A procession of curious onlookers and self-styled scientists extracted samples of her hair, pulled out her teeth, and hacked at her limbs for anatomical study. By 1790, all that remained in the coffin were scattered bones and tattered cloth. Concerned that Catherine's final resting place had become a desecrated curiosity, the Reverend John Shipton led efforts in 1817 to recover the scattered remains. Working by lamplight in the ruined chapel, he gathered what fragments were left: bare femurs, a portion of skull, and a few strands of golden hair. These remnants were rewrapped in fresh shrouds and reinterred in a temporary vault. Finally, in 1861, a dignified monument was erected in Street, Mary's Chapel at Sudeley, and the accumulated relics of Catherine Parr were placed within an iron casket beneath the marble slab. Though her physical tomb underwent cycles of decay and restoration, Catherine Parr's intellectual and spiritual legacy proved far more enduring. Her two published works, Prayers or Meditations, 1544, and Lamentation of a Sinner, 1546, continued to circulate among Protestant households. Historians credit her with normalizing the practice of private devotion in English and advocating for women's education. As the first Queen author and the only Queen Regent in Tudor England, she set precedents that echoed through subsequent reigns. In the quiet gardens of Sudeley, where her body finally rests in peace, the memory of Catherine Parr endures a testament not only to her survival of Henry's caprices, but to her lasting impact on the faith, governance, and letters of her nation. In the quiet aftermath of Catherine Parr's stormy life, her legacy blooms in several distinct yet intertwined petals. First and foremost, she stands as the inaugural English queen to place her own name upon the printed page. In March of 1544, her Prayers or Meditations emerged under her true signature, and 2 years later, Lamentation of a Sinner reaffirmed her role as a trailblazing author. At a time when the production of books remained the province of male theologians and scholars, Catherine's voice resonating through the royal press signaled a profound shift. Women could not only read theology, but also interpret it, and thereby shape the spiritual discourse of the realm. Linked to her authorship was her vigorous advocacy for female education. Catherine's own formative years under Maud Green had instilled in her a respect for learning that she then applied to the royal household. She ensured that Princess Elizabeth, Princess Mary, and even the daughters of noble families in her retinue received lessons in Latin and French, in mathematics and the classics. Though gendered prejudices lingered, many still believed that women's proper domain lay only in domestic matters. Catherine's example as a learned queen demonstrated that intellectual accomplishment and feminine grace were not mutually exclusive. Beyond literary and educational reforms, Catherine's diplomatic skills preserved the fragile unity of the Tudor line during the final phase of Henry VIII's reign and the early years of Edward VI's minority. Her successful petition that restored Mary and Elizabeth to succession rights established a precedent of familial reconciliation seldom witnessed in Henry's court. In the difficult months of 1544, when war drums sounded again in France, she assumed the regency with unblemished tact, guiding the kingdom through legislative sessions and courtly audiences without a single recorded misstep. In so doing, Catherine proved that a queen's influence need not rest solely upon ceremonial splendour. Rather, the soft power of wise counsel could hold entire governments together. Yet it is the crucible of tragedy that perhaps most sharply etched Catherine Parr's reputation for diligence, courage, and sagacity. She faced down the spectre of the scaffold when her Protestant writings drew the ire of conservative counsellors. She navigated the perilous waters of court favour, surviving where so many of her predecessors had perished. She endeavoured in secret romance with Thomas Seymour, only to suffer heartbreak and scandal upon his betrayal. And at the summit of her personal joy maternity at the age of 36, she succumbed to the ravages of childbed fever. Throughout each trial, her resolve never faltered. Her comportment remained measured and generous, even in the face of profound grief. This tapestry of accomplishments and sufferings has inspired storytellers and scholars in equal measure. The 2023 film Firebrand reimagines Catherine's theological debates with Henry as a clash of wills that nearly cost her life. The West End musical Six pays affectionate tribute to her place in Henry's matrimonial history, celebrating her as the one who survived and championing her intellectual spark. Countless articles and monographs examine how Catherine's regency shaped English governance, how her patronage of Protestant thinkers advanced the Reformation, and how her pioneering voice opened doors for women writers in the centuries that followed. Ironically, the physical site of Catherine Parr's rest has itself become a chronicle of neglect and fascination. During the English Civil War, Sudeley Castle fell to troops and suffered ruin, its chapel desecrated and her tomb disturbed. In 1782, the lead coffin was unsealed, and the Queen's body, remarkably preserved, was subjected to scientific curiosities that peeled away linens, extracted hair, and scattered bones. It was not until 1861 that her remains were reinterred beneath a new monument in St. Mary's Chapel, restoring some dignity to her earthly remains. Yet the successive disturbances of her grave attest to the enduring public curiosity her life inspires an echo of how Catherine herself balanced visibility with agency in her own time. Ultimately, Catherine Parr's name transcends the gilded trappings of royal favour to stand as a symbol of devoted service, fearless conviction, and pioneering intellect. She demonstrated that a queen might be more than a passive ornament of state. She could be a custodian of faith, a negotiator of peace, and a shaper of culture. In her quiet yet resolute voice, she spoke truth to power, nurtured future monarchs, and laid groundwork for women's voices in the written word. Long after Henry's marble effigies have worn smooth and the Tudor palaces have succumbed to repurposing, Catherine Parr endures in the annals of history, an emblem of what a woman of learning and grace might achieve, even amid the fiercest storms of political and personal upheaval. After so many trials and losses, Catherine Parr's legacy did not end with her books and royal decrees. It was also forged through the way she shaped the futures of the three royal children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Because Catherine Parr and Henry VIII had no children together, those three were all born to Henry with his earlier queens, and Catherine served only as their stepmother. With a gentle heart and a keen mind, she took an active role in educating them, protecting them, and restoring their positions at court. We have just witnessed Catherine's steadfast defence of her faith, her governance of the realm, and her comforting of the king. Now, let us enter the palace, where she was not only the surviving queen, but also the devoted guardian, the passionate teacher, and the spiritual guide for these three Tudor seedlings. In the royal lineage of Henry VIII, Edward VI stood as his third legitimate child and only son, Edward VI, a boy whose brief life would nevertheless be shaped indelibly by the steady hand of his stepmother, Catherine Parr. From the moment he was born on the 12th of October in the year 1537, Edward's destiny was bound to the crown, but it was Catherine who, in his formative years, became both tutor and guide, weaving together threads of learning and piety that would influence his reign even after her departure. From the autumn of 1537 onward, Catherine Parr took a personal interest in fashioning a rigorous educational program for the young prince. Recognizing that Latin remained the lingua franca of diplomacy and scholarship, she secured the services of the esteemed scholar Richard Cox, later Bishop of Ely, to provide daily lessons in Latin grammar and scripture. Each morning, Edward would recite passages from Cicero's letters and portions of the Vulgate in Latin, his small voice echoing in the vaulted chambers of Hampton Court. By midday, he would switch to French with another tutor, mastering the subtleties of courtly conversation necessary for engaging ambassadors from France and the Holy Roman Empire. But Catherine's curriculum extended beyond mere languages. Theology occupied a central place in Edward's studies. She provided him with English translations of the scriptures' texts that she herself had encouraged at a time when the vernacular Bible was still controversial. In private reading sessions, Catherine would sit beside Edward in the Queen's closet, opening her own copy of prayers or meditations to illustrate themes of grace and repentance. Edward learned to contrast the ornate ceremonies of the Old Mass with the simplicity of evangelical worship, absorbing his stepmother's conviction that true devotion lay in a humble heart rather than in elaborate ritual. It was Catherine's own religious writings that left the deepest impression. As she revised her lamentation of a sinner at her desk, the young prince observed the process, witnessing her careful selection of scriptural passages and her evocative commentary on the nature of sin and redemption. Though only 7 years old when the final edits were being made, Edward grasped that faith could be both deeply personal and thoroughly intellectual. He would later cite in his proclamations the language she favoured, an emphasis on inward sincerity and moral responsibility that echoed throughout his brief regency. Edward's education under Catherine's tutelage reached its practical apogee in June of 1544, when his father departed for France. Henry appointed Catherine Parr regent, in his absence the first English queen ever to govern in such a capacity. With quill in hand and seal at her side, Catherine signed royal decrees, convened Privy Council meetings, and oversaw the administration of justice. Young Edward, then aged 6, observed these sessions from behind the dais in St. James's Palace, entranced by the dignity and deliberation with which his stepmother conducted affairs of state. In those weeks, Edward saw firsthand the balance Catherine struck between firmness and compassion. When petitions poured in from subjects seeking relief from taxation or disputing local judgments, Catherine heard them with an open mind, ruling that laws should serve the people as much as they upheld royal prerogative. She also intervened to protect church lands under certain conditions, reflecting the Protestant principle that wealth must not overshadow true spiritual duty. Edward absorbed these lessons in governance, learning that a ruler's responsibility lay in stewardship rather than sheer authority. When Henry VIII died in January of 1547, Edward ascended the throne at the tender age of 9. Though Catherine had relinquished the regency as stipulated in the late king's will, her influence remained. The boy king's first edicts echoed the balanced tone she had modelled. A continued removal of superstitious images from churches and a reaffirmation of Scripture as the highest authority in matters of faith. At his coronation on the 20th of February, Edward wore a mantle of crimson velvet trimmed in ermine, yet it was Catherine's intellectual and spiritual mantle that truly adorned him. Throughout Edward's reign, his counsels and proclamations bore the hallmark of Catherine's early mentorship. He issued the 42 Articles of Religion in 1553, a blueprint for England's Protestant Church, drawing upon theological foundations first laid in his lessons with the Queen Regent. His commitment to educating clergy in both Latin and English echoed Catherine's conviction that true faith required both scholarly rigour and accessibility to the common person. Though Edward's life would be cut short in July of 1553, at the age of 15, the policies he championed would endure long past his demise. His support for charitable schools and his authorization of fairs to distribute Bibles in the vernacular bore the unmistakable imprint of Catherine Parr's vision. In the hush of Hampton Court's empty corridors, where once he sat wide-eyed during Catherine's tutoring sessions, echoes remain of the soft pronouncement of Latin declensions and the quiet affirmation of heartfelt prayer. In this way, Catherine Parr's legacy lived on in her stepson, not only as the first Queen author and regent, but as mentor to the boy king, whose brief reign would solidify the Protestant foundations she so ardently promoted. Through language, theology, and governance, she shaped Edward VI into a monarch who believed that power was a sacred trust, an inheritance not merely of lineage, but of conscience and learning. And so, in the gentle imprint she left upon his education, Catherine Parr's influence endured, fading only with the final crackle of ancient vellum, but resonating still in the annals of Tudor history. In the constellation of Henry VIII's offspring, Mary I shone as his firstborn daughter, yet her path to the throne was fraught with heartbreak and reversal, long before Catherine Parr ever entered the picture. Born on the 18th day of February in the year 1516, Mary Tudor was, for 20 years, the legitimate heir to the crown, until her father's turbulent marital history overturned her prospects. Disinherited in April of 1533, after Henry's annulment of his marriage to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, she watched as her half-brother Edward, born in October of 1537, was declared heir, and her younger half-sister Elizabeth, born in September of 1533, similarly denied her birthright. Into this fractured royal family stepped Catherine Parr in July of 1543. Catherine, who had served as both stepmother and regent, recognized the injustice of Mary's exclusion and quietly set to work on her behalf. As winter gave way to spring in 1544, Catherine approached King Henry at Hampton Court with a petition framed not in terms of political expediency, but of familial duty and moral rectitude. She reminded the king that Mary was his daughter by God's law as much as by man's, and that restoring her place in succession would heal wounds that had festered for over a decade. On the first day of May in 1544, Henry acknowledged Catherine's entreaties by issuing letters patent that readmitted both Mary and Elizabeth into the line of succession, placing them, in order, immediately after Edward. The act was not merely legal formality, but a profound gesture of reconciliation. Mary, then 28 years old, heard the proclamation in the Chapel Royal, her eyes brimming with tears as the royal heralds proclaimed her no longer illegitimate, but once more true and lawful heir to the throne. Catherine, standing discreetly at the king's elbow, offered Mary a gentle embrace, a gesture of maternal solidarity that Mary would later recall as the first moment she felt truly acknowledged by a royal stepmother. In the months that followed, Catherine's influence ensured Mary regained both her title and her dignity. Mary was invited back into court life. She sat at the high table alongside the king, attended Privy Council meetings when matters pertaining to her restoration were discussed, and received dispatches in her own name, rather than as a disfavoured daughter. Catherine personally supervised Mary's re-education in matters of state ceremony and court etiquette, lending her books on both classical history and contemporary affairs. Under Catherine's guidance, Mary was encouraged to resume her study of Latin, not merely to read Gothic texts of canon law, but to participate in the humanist dialogues that formed the intellectual backbone of the Reformation. For Mary, whose fervent Catholic faith had been a source of both comfort and exile, Catherine's support also opened the door to measured religious dialogue. While Mary privately upheld the doctrines of her mother's church, Catherine introduced her to moderate Protestant thinkers, not to convert her, but to foster mutual understanding within the fractured court. Evening discussions in the Queen's closet would find Mary and Catherine poring over passages from Augustine and Calvin, each woman learning to appreciate the other's interpretation of faith. Mary later credited these sessions with tempering her eventual resolve to restore Catholicism with mercy and moderation, even as she came to the throne years later. Despite Catherine's efforts, underlying tensions persisted. Many of the king's councillors loyal to the Church of England regarded Mary with suspicion. Yet Catherine's unwavering advocacy shielded Mary from overt hostility. When conservative courtiers suggested limiting Mary's attendance or confining her to a distant manor, Catherine interceded, reminding Henry that his daughter's presence at court was both his right and a testament to his fatherly responsibility. Mary, emboldened by this protection, found the confidence to speak at court functions, delivering speeches in polished French and Latin that surprised even the haughtiest ambassadors. Catherine's final months saw Mary settled in a gracious suite of apartments at Chelsea Manor, near the Queen's own chambers. Here, Mary entertained visiting dignitaries and maintained her own small household, yet always found time for Catherine's counsel. On summer evenings they would stroll the garden terraces, where Catherine confided her hopes for a united Tudor dynasty, and Mary spoke of her dreams to one day marry and secure her lineage. Though time was short, Catherine would pass away in September of 1548. The bond forged between stepmother and stepdaughter became a touchstone for Mary's later reign. When Catherine's death was announced, Mary mourned openly, adorning herself in plain black and withdrawing from court for several weeks. In a letter to her sister Elizabeth, Mary wrote of Catherine, "She was to me a mother in mercy and a friend in truth. Her memory shall abide in my heart as a beacon of reconciliation." It was upon this foundation of restored status, personal encouragement, and broadened perspective that Mary I would ascend the throne in July of 1553. Though her reign would take a far more zealous turn than Catherine might have wished, the measure of tolerance and administrative propriety Mary showed in her early months, allowing Protestants to worship in private and maintaining an orderly court, owed much to the maternal influence of Catherine Parr. In this way, Catherine Parr's legacy lived on within Mary I, not only as the queen who mended broken lines of succession, but as the stepmother who dared to heal hearts and minds in an age riven by religious and political strife. Through her guidance, Mary learned that legitimate rule rested not only on blood, but on the goodwill and respect of subjects, a lesson that would both elevate and, regrettably, complicate Mary's own reign in the turbulent years to come. In the royal family of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I was the third legitimate child and second daughter, born on the 7th day of September in the year 1533. Though her early years were marked by the turmoil of her mother's fall from favour and her own illegitimacy, Elizabeth's fortunes were revived in part through the devoted guidance of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. As Elizabeth grew into a bright and curious child, Catherine took a personal interest in shaping her education, planting the seeds of learning and eloquence that would later bloom in the reign of England's most celebrated monarch. From the autumn of 1544 onward, Catherine Parr ensured that Elizabeth's studies went well beyond the rudimentary lessons typical of a Tudor noblewoman. She personally oversaw a rigorous program in Latin grammar and composition, hiring the esteemed humanist scholar Roger Ascham, who would later tutor Elizabeth herself, to conduct daily sessions in Cicero's Orations and Virgil's Aeneid. Under Catherine's watchful eye, Elizabeth learned not only to read the original Latin texts, but also to edit and annotate manuscript drafts by hand, refining her understanding of classical rhetoric and narrative structure. Catherine also arranged for French conversation lessons with François van der Delft, the French ambassador's secretary, enabling Elizabeth to negotiate diplomatically in the king's court and correspond fluently with foreign dignitaries. By the age of 10, Elizabeth could recite passages from the Church Fathers in Latin and discuss theological concepts drawn from both Catholic and Protestant sources, reflecting Catherine's desire that Elizabeth develop a balanced, informed perspective on religious debate. Moreover, Catherine introduced Elizabeth to the visual and musical arts. Within the ornate galleries of Hampton Court, Elizabeth observed miniature painting techniques at the elbow of Nicholas Hilliard and listened to the latest madrigals performed by the king's musicians. Catherine encouraged her stepdaughter to try her hand at both, believing that a future queen would need not only the power of words but also an appreciation for the images and sounds that shaped courtly expression. As Elizabeth practiced copying illuminated letters and experimented with lute chords, she internalized the concept that art could convey political nuance as surely as any proclamation. Perhaps most critically, Catherine exposed Elizabeth to the ideas of the Reformation and Renaissance humanism. In intimate afternoon salons, Catherine invited theologians sympathetic to Protestant reform, among them Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, to discuss themes of individual conscience, the authority of Scripture, and the role of a ruler in matters of faith. Elizabeth listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both her sharp intellect and her developing sense of moderation. Catherine's insistence that Elizabeth encounter these challenging texts early on laid the groundwork for the Queen's later policy of religious compromise and tolerance, ensuring that church and state might coexist with minimal sectarian violence. Through these comprehensive lessons spanning classical literature, foreign languages, sacred debate, and the arts, Catherine Parr transformed a vulnerable royal child into a polymath in miniature. Elizabeth's facility with languages, her facility with pen and paintbrush, and her facility with theology would become the hallmarks of a queen whose learning and poise dazzled continental courts. In Elizabeth's later years, long after Catherine Parr's untimely death, the memory of her stepmother persisted as a guiding light. In a private letter to Robert Cecil dated the 15th of June, 1589, Elizabeth recalled Catherine's gentle counsel and steadfast devotion, crediting her with instilling in her the love of books, the discipline of study, and the compassion of mercy. Elizabeth's reference to Catherine in her correspondence highlights how deeply she valued the intellectual and moral foundation laid by her former stepmother. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth surrounded herself with symbols that recalled Catherine Parr's influence. She preserved Catherine's personal copy of prayers or meditations, the very volume Catherine had read aloud to the young Prince Edward, in a velvet-bound case on her private nightstand. In the gardens of Whitehall Palace, Elizabeth maintained a secluded rose arbour, much like the one where she and Catherine once strolled, using the space for quiet reflection and study. Visitors to Elizabeth's chamber also noted the presence of an embroidered cushion, inscribed with Catherine's favourite Latin motto, Cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart, a testament to the emotional bond they had shared. Perhaps most enduring was Elizabeth's approach to governance, her celebrated Elizabethan compromise. When crafting the Act of Uniformity in 1559, which established a moderate Protestant church, Elizabeth drew upon the spirit of reconciliation she had learned from Catherine. By allowing a degree of ceremonial flexibility and ensuring that clergy remained well educated, Elizabeth mirrored Catherine's own balance of piety and pragmatism. Her avoidance of extreme persecution and her reliance on reasoned debate over coercion reflected the very ethos Catherine had championed in her short regency. By the end of her 44-year reign, the longest in English history up to that time, Elizabeth I had woven the threads of learning, tolerance, and diplomatic acumen into a golden tapestry now known as the Elizabethan Age. Yet behind every tapestry lies a warp and weft, and in Elizabeth's case, Catherine Parr's gentle hand had guided the loom. In letters, in garden retreats, in the statutes that shaped the Church of England, and in the graceful, witty speeches delivered before Parliament, Catherine's legacy endured, echoing in the triumphs of a queen who had once been a vulnerable stepdaughter, inspired by a stepmother's steadfast devotion to learning and mercy. And so, as we draw the curtains gently across the final pages of Catherine Parr's extraordinary journey, let us slow our breath and soften our thoughts. Imagine the quiet corridors of Sudeley Castle at dusk, where candlelight flickers upon aged tapestries and the hush of history settles like a soft blanket. In that fading glow, we feel the enduring warmth of Catherine's courage, the steady beacon that guided her through loss, turmoil, and the dizzying heights of royal power. Her life reminds us that true strength often speaks in whispers rather than shouts, that compassion and learning can outlast the sharpest swords, and that a single voice raised in prayer, penned in a book, or spoken in council can echo across centuries. Even as her name became entwined with scandal, ambition, and heartbreak, it was Catherine's kindness toward her stepchildren, her fearless devotion to education, and her gentle insistence on tolerance that illuminated the darker corners of the Tudor court. Now, let your mind drift like a leaf on a quiet stream, carried away from the tumult of palaces and political intrigue. Picture Elizabeth, Mary, and Edward, each holding their late stepmother's hand in spirit as they stepped into their own great destinies, inspired by her example of mercy and intellect. Feel Catherine's calm presence in the soft rustle of pages turning, in the measured cadence of Latin prayers, in the pastel hues of a garden in early spring. As your eyelids grow heavy, let the message of her life settle within you, that adversity can be met with grace, that learning is a lifelong embrace, and that every act of kindness, however small, contributes to a more compassionate world. In the hush of this moment, Catherine's whisper becomes our own gentle reminder to cherish knowledge, to nurture understanding, and to offer comfort where it is needed most. Thank you for accompanying us on this journey through Tudor halls and private chapels, through whispered debates and tender farewells. If you have found solace in Catherine Parr's story, we invite you to subscribe so that you may awaken to new tales, each one more enchanting than the last. Sleep now, wrapped in the soft glow of history's quiet wonders. Good night, and sweet dreams.